And now, the first of this afternoon's three keynote speakers. Dr. Larry Lezotte is known as a preeminent spokesperson for effective schools research and implementation. He has written numerous books based on the 7 correlates of effective schools and is an internationally renowned education consultant and commentator. Please welcome Dr. Larry Lezotte.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking the trustees and Dr. Spence for inviting me to participate in what has to be the largest faculty meeting I've ever been to in my whole life. I've been asked to talk for a few minutes about, it's one thing to say I believe, and then you have to have action. You have to have a theory of action to go forward, and what I want to talk to you about very quickly is a theory of action based on 4 decades of research called the Effective Schools Research and Practices. Over the last 4 decades, and we started in the late 60s, early 70s, and it keeps accumulating, we have more and more research to know more about what's happening now, and we have more research to know that about how to make this work in schools and in districts that where this can work. And also the number of schools and school districts that have increased using this research, increased their student achievement, continues to grow around the world, in the United States, Canada, and other countries. The first thing I'd like to do is to give you a brief definition of an effective school. If you go to the dictionary and look up the word effective school, an effective school, it says, the word effective first, says doing the right job. So my sense is that we ought to start with a definition that gives the school the right job to do. So my conceptual definition goes like this. An effective school is a school that can, in outcome, performance, or results terms, in student outcomes, performances, or results terms, reflective of its learning for all mission, meaning you better be prepared if that's not your mission to successfully teach every child, each child, all children, then this work would not be what you would want to lean on and look to. Learning for all. Demonstrate the presence of equity in quality. Equity in quality. We don't talk about quality alone because sometimes that gets confused with just the high achievers. We've got to talk about not only how well all of the kids are doing, but look at the various subsets of kids that we're responsible for. So we talk about equity and quality. One of the writers whose work I often cite, I don't always agree with her, is Diane Ravitch. And in one of the books earlier on, she wrote a book titled The Schools We Deserve. And in that book, she said, in a democracy like yours and ours, there must be an indissoluble link between issues of quality and issues of equity. She went on to say that if a country or a community or a school district chooses to ignore one or the other and not paying simultaneous attention to both, whichever one you choose to ignore, at the end of the day will bring down that organization, that institution, that community, that country. So that's the basis of our work. We want to look at quality and equity. We want to look at it as it extends to all children, not just some children. And we want to be sure that we are committed to the mission of learning for all. Now, in your situation, what you want to be concerned about more than the absolute definition per se is the question of school improvement, continuous improvement. So let's look at the concept and see what it looks like in the real world. The primary difference between this definition of improving schools and the effective school is simply that we're interested in change over time. We want to see that your school is doing better this year than last and next year rather than this. So we're looking at continuous improvement, and if we had our druthers, we always like to look at continuous improvement in reference to the school that we're in. So we're not necessarily looking at some normed process. We're saying we want each school to commit to continuous improvement, to look at their situation, look at their students, look where they need to do work, come up with plans of action and strategies, and go from there. When we go into one of these schools that has high overall levels of achievement and no gaps in the distribution of that achievement, and we start to try to understand how did they get that way, that's a concept that we want to look at. And if any of you are interested in reading, or maybe some of you have read the book by one of the Canadian authors that talks about outliers. Malcolm Gladwell has a book out called Outliers. In Outliers, we're interested in outliers on the high side. Those schools that are serving particularly difficult populations of kids, who over the last 40 years have been able to raise the achievement of all of those kids in that school. And it's trying to understand what they have done and what they do that makes that difference, that becomes the knowledge base that we hope that some of your schools have already drawn on or will draw on going forward. What we find when we look at schools in that regard, and we find these high-performing schools that particularly serve disadvantaged kids, economically disadvantaged kids, and other racial and ethnic groups and so forth, what we try to find is what makes the difference, and when we come up with that, what we end up with is what has become to be known as the correlates of effective schools. Now let me tell you very briefly why the correlates of effective schools matter to you. If you're trying to produce better results, better performance in your kids, you can't look just at the performance you got yesterday to help inform what you ought to do tomorrow. What you have to do is look at the things that cause student learning, cause student achievement. And there are two sets of variables that schools need to be cognizant of, schools need to talk about, form collaborative work teams around. And the two sets of variables that we talk about are, number one, the organizational characteristics or correlates of effective schools, which are associated with our work, and I'll give you a short list in just a couple of minutes. And the other body of work that needs to be brought into the conversation are the correlates of effective schools that are based on the principles of human learning, based on the principles of human learning. It may sound ironic, but schools right now are not really organized around learning. They're more or less organized around teaching and hope that the learning follows. We've got to be much more intentional about focusing the work of the teachers, the classrooms, and the school around learning. To do that, then, what we need to differentiate is the distinction between what we'll call trailing indicators. Student learning and student performance are trailing indicators. They trail behind the learning, they trail behind these other variables. And so what we want to work on then is to get you as school people to organize some of your efforts at improvement around what we'll call the leading indicators of learning.